Buenas tardes, bienvenidos a todas y a todos a este acto inaugural del Congreso Internacional de Teoría de la Educación, CITE 2020+1, +1. Permítanme, bienvenidos también y bienvenidas a todas las personas que nos están atendiendo vía online. Aquí todavía con las materias de COVID estamos con un aforo pequeño, limitado, pero se está siguiendo ampliamente a través de las redes. Permítame que presente a mis acompañantes en esta mesa presidencial, a nuestro querido decano de la Facultad de Educación, Centro de Formación de Profesorado de esta Universidad, el profesor Gonzalo Jover Olmeda, por lo tanto nuestro anfitrión. Pero, Gonzalo, muchas gracias por invitarme a estar aquí. Joaquín. Inmediatamente a mi izquierda, la profesora Elena Martínez Carro, decana de la Facultad de Educación de la Universidad Internacional de La Rioja, UNIR, que hace tiempo que nos vimos y han cambiado mucho las cosas desde la primera y última vez que nos vimos. Inmediatamente en el extremo derecho de la mesa, la profesora Elena Saénz-Rico de Santiago, directora del Departamento de Estudios Educativos, Facultad de Educación, Centro de Formación del Profesorado de la UCM. Querida Belén, un honor estar contigo. Y en el extremo izquierdo, y al final, y no menos importante, ni mucho menos, la profesora Paloma Redondo Corcovado, coordinadora de la Red de Jóvenes Investigadores en Teoría de la Educación. Y yo soy Joaquín Goyache, rector de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Reiterando la bienvenida, vamos a comenzar sin más dilación para no retrasar mucho este acto y dar paso luego a la conferencia inaugural. Cedo a la profesora Paloma Redondo Corcovado.
Bueno, pues buenas tardes a todos y todas. Bienvenidos a nuestra facultad y en muchos casos a Madrid, ¿no? En primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por invitarme, ¿no?, a esta mesa de inauguración como coordinadora de la Red de Jóvenes Investigadores en Teoría de la Educación. Es una posibilidad de visibilizar un poco la red y también de agradecer, ahora que ha pasado, porque la celebramos sábado y domingo, el éxito gracias a la excelente coordinación en la organización de todos los compañeros que han participado, todos los ponentes, participantes, comunicantes que han estado. Y aprovecho también para dar un agradecimiento al Colegio Mayor Santa María de Europa, que nos ha facilitado el espacio para poder realizarlo, puesto que el fin de semana es un poco complicado abrir la facultad. Así que nada, pues reiterar un poco la importancia de espacios en los que se compartan ideas, pensamientos, en los que surjan nuevos conocimientos, intereses, redes de trabajo entre jóvenes. Y bueno, desde aquí animo a todas las universidades, ya que tengo oportunidad de ver así un poco el panorama nacional, de que animen a sus jóvenes investigadores, jóvenes en términos de carrera académica, nos da igual qué edad tengan, a que vengan a la jornada, a que aporten sus ideas y, en definitiva, a que compartan un pequeño espacio con nosotras y con nosotros. Así que, sin más, espero que disfruten mucho del Congreso. Está organizado con el mayor de los cariños y bueno, se ha podido organizar todo, yo creo que con bastante éxito. En cualquier caso, pues si tenéis alguna duda, sabéis que siempre estamos por aquí. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Paloma, por tus palabras. Tiene la palabra la directora del Departamento de Estudios Educativos.
Excelentísimo rector, compañeros, autoridades académicas, estimados colegas que estáis asistiendo a este acto de inauguración. Para el Departamento de Estudios Educativos es un privilegio y un honor estar con vosotros compartiendo este momento. ¿Por qué? Porque tanto el CITE, que se desarrolla en jornada de mañana, el Seminario Internacional de Teoría de la Educación, y el Congreso Internacional, son un referente en el ámbito de la pedagogía. Estamos en momentos muy convulsos, en unos momentos en los que a la educación se nos pide afrontar muchos retos, contribuir a un cambio de modelo de desarrollo y de un modelo de sociedad, y por lo tanto es fundamental que desde la teoría y de la práctica pongamos en solfa, revisemos, hagamos una buena revisión desde un pensamiento y una reflexión crítica sobre los modelos sobre los cuales se ha fundamentado la escuela actual y revisar hacia dónde tenemos que ir. Por lo tanto, ojalá que de este encuentro, de estos días, salgan palabras, salgan nuevas directrices para que todos juntos podamos no dejar a nadie atrás, que son las directrices de la ONU y de los ODS. Muchísimas gracias y lo mejor para el Congreso.
Muchas gracias, Belén. Tiene la palabra la profesora Elena Martínez, Carro. Decana.
Bueno, unas brevísimas palabras, primero de todo para agradecer a Gonzalo, especialmente, que haya querido contar con UNIR desde hace casi 3 años por su empeño en sacar adelante este congreso, que realmente ha sido como una verdadera hazaña. Para él fue una meta cuando pidió que UNIR colaborara con este congreso, y para nosotros un honor haber podido estar siguiendo su trayectoria en estos años, aunque siempre nos hubiese gustado apoyar más, ayudar más, pero ha sido pues verdaderamente una suerte poder estar aquí en un congreso de tantísima referencia y siendo pues eso, esta casa nuestra que siempre nos acoge, la Universidad Complutense, especialmente con su rector, con el cual tenemos y con todos vosotros tantísimas relaciones y tan buenas relaciones, ¿no? Bueno, pues este honor se hace extensible también a la Universidad Complutense y, por supuesto, al seminario, al CITE, al Seminario Interuniversitario de Teoría de la Educación, que ha querido sacar pues, para este 15º Congreso Internacional de Teoría de la Educación con un tema que creemos todos de indudable interés, ¿no? Sobre todo por la celebración del 50 aniversario de la Ley General de Educación. Perdón. Entonces, esta ley que marcó un antes y un después, que realmente es una ley que puso, como bien han dicho anteriormente, el sistema educativo patas arriba y que realmente después de 50 años marca un punto de inflexión sobre el que se reflexionará aquí estos días, ¿no? Con las leyes sucesivas que han seguido. Realmente marcó el punto de inflexión de la democracia española, pero también todo un punto de reflexión que espero que estos días puedan llevar entre todos a cabo. Para nosotros un honor estar aquí, un honor compartir estos momentos y esperemos que sea todo lo mejor posible. Nos tenéis a vuestra disposición en cualquier momento. Muchísimas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Elena. Tiene la palabra el profesor Gonzalo Jover, decano.
Bueno, pues queridos compañeros de la mesa y queridos también participantes en el Congreso Internacional de Teoría de la Educación, en primer lugar, por daros una bienvenida calurosa y muy afectiva. Teníamos muchísimas ganas de ver gente aquí en la facultad, de poder reunirnos, de poder hablar, de poder estrecharnos si nos dejan la mano. En fin, muchísimas ganas. Y evidentemente estoy agradecido a muchísima gente. Primero a vosotros mismos, porque os animasteis a venir, lo cual era una decisión que no siempre fue fácil. Tenemos participantes pues, de todos los puntos de España. Tenemos también mucha gente de fuera de España que nos siguen online. Hay una parte importante del Congreso que se sigue haciendo online porque para mucha gente no hay otra posibilidad ahora mismo de poder hacerlo. Así que de verdad muchísimas gracias a todos y a todas por estar aquí. Esto es el resultado de un trabajo colectivo de mucho tiempo que está fundamentalmente apoyado en el trabajo de un comité organizador tremendo, muy dedicado. Muchísimas gracias a todos, a Josu, a Juan Luis, a Carolina, a Yaiza, a Paloma, porque el trabajo, sobre todo en las últimas semanas, pues ha sido impresionante. Ha habido que ver cada detalle. Yo solamente en las últimas semanas lo que imploraba es que no nos confinasen hoy, porque tal como estaba el panorama, yo dije, es lo último que nos quedaría. Así que de verdad, muchas gracias. Gracias también a los conferenciantes de las conferencias plenarias, a Paddy Hogan, que se ha animado a venir desde Irlanda, y realmente es un acto de valentía grande, Paddy, animarte, aunque sea dentro de Europa, a moverte. De verdad te agradecemos muchísimo que estés. A Antonio Canales, que es compañero del departamento, pero es de otra área. Así que muchas gracias, Tony, por animarte a meterte en este lío de los teóricos de la educación. Y al profesor Adela Cortina, que no ha venido todavía, llegará el día de la conferencia, pero que también, evidentemente, en estas circunstancias, decidir trasladarse, pues siempre es un acto que hay que agradecer. Y después, representados en muchísima gente, pues a los propios participantes en la mesa, por el orden que han hablado, pues a Paloma Redondo, que, un día le cayó tener que encargarse de la coordinación de la red de los jóvenes investigadores en teoría de la educación. Hoy, en todos los ámbitos de conocimiento, en todas las organizaciones internacionales, se cuida la formación de los jóvenes investigadores, porque eso forma parte de la esencia de la universidad. La universidad es un organismo vivo, y como es un organismo vivo se tiene que reproducir, y si no cuidamos la investigación de los jóvenes, pues eso malamente luego va a dar frutos buenos. Han estado trabajando muchísimo, yo pude acompañarlos un rato el sábado y realmente da gusto ver la calidad de los trabajos de la juventud de nuestro ámbito. Así que muchísimas gracias, Paloma. A Belén, que es la directora de mi departamento, es mi directora en el fondo. O sea, yo estoy entre dos jefes en el fondo, aquí he situado, que desde el primer día apoyó muchísimo la celebración de este congreso. Este congreso son tres cosas: es el congreso, es el seminario, que es más restringido, de los profesores de teoría de educación, y es la jornada de los jóvenes, y desde el primer día estuvo ahí apoyándonos en un área además que tampoco es la suya. Nuestro departamento de estudios educativos acoge el área de teoría y de historia de la educación, entonces se inscribe el congreso, y el área de didáctica y organización escolar, que es a la que pertenece la directora, pero ella no lo dudó, dentro de una política que tiene muy buena, realmente, de buscar la integración de esas dos áreas, y siempre nos apoyó. Además, les tengo que decir que no nos apoyó solo moralmente, sino también de otras maneras que también son necesarias y son muy de agradecer. A Elena, madre mía, Elena, yo recordaba hace un rato las conversaciones aquellas que tuvimos a la altura de marzo del año pasado, y qué hacemos, y ahora cómo vamos a atacar esto que se nos viene encima. Entonces no sabíamos lo que se nos venía encima realmente. Si lo llegamos a saber, yo creo que nos echaba a correr. Pero de verdad, muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos, por animaros a organizar este congreso conjuntamente con la Universidad Complutense, y a todo el apoyo técnico que nos están brindando, porque la parte online fundamentalmente corre a cargo de la UNIR. Tiene pues evidentemente mucha experiencia en esto, y también, lo tengo que decir, por ofrecernos la recepción de esta tarde, que será en la Casa de La Rioja, y esperamos todo lo mejor realmente de la región a la que representáis, ¿no? Así que muchísimas gracias. Y bueno, y a Joaquín, porque esté aquí, el rector. Imaginaros lo que es la agenda de un rector, para sacar un rato para acompañarnos y para estar aquí en la Facultad de Educación. La educación tiene ya un recorrido muy largo en la universidad, desde que en 1904 se creó en esta propia universidad la primera cátedra de pedagogía, luego vinieron las secciones de pedagogía, también en esta universidad en primer lugar, luego en Barcelona, luego la integración de las escuelas de magisterio, que lo hizo la ley del 70, que estamos conmemorando ahora. Bueno, ya no sé exactamente qué aniversario, porque como han pasado años de todo este lío, pero bueno, suponemos que es el 50 aniversario, ¿no? Pero realmente yo creo que la presencia aquí del rector no solamente un acto testimonial, un acto protocolario, por decirlo así, realmente es una muestra del apoyo que la educación y la investigación educativa y lo que hacemos en esta facultad, a fin de cuentas, tiene para la propia universidad. Y eso es muy de agradecer. Cuando las escuelas de magisterio se integraron en el año 70 en las universidades, las escuelas sentían que no estaban del todo bien integradas dentro de la universidad, que eran como órganos un poco separados, y realmente yo puedo decir que al menos en la Complutense eso no es así. Esta facultad es una facultad que juega con las mismas condiciones y en la misma liga que absolutamente todas las demás, con un apoyo tremendo a todos los proyectos que tenemos, que son muchos, siempre desde el rectorado de la Complutense, y ahora sencillamente eso lo manifiesta la propia presencia del rector Joaquín Goyache aquí entre nosotros. Así que de verdad, Joaquín, muchísimas gracias. Voy a intentar ya ser breve. Este es el congreso de la red del Seminario de Teoría de la Educación. Esta es una red que nació hace ahora 40 años, en 1982, y este es el congreso número 15. Es la segunda vez que este congreso viene a la Complutense. Por primera vez lo hizo en el año 1991, o sea, hace 30, volvemos a repetir pues 30 años más tarde. El tema que buscamos para este congreso es el binomio entre tradición y democracia. Esas dos cosas van juntas, esas dos cosas van separadas, se oponen de alguna manera, y eso cómo se incardina en la educación, cómo contempla la educación y cómo desde la teoría de la educación pensamos eso, tanto el fenómeno de la tradición, qué sentido tiene la tradición en la educación, qué sentido tiene la democracia en la educación, y ya que suponemos que ambas cosas tienen sentido, cómo las conjugamos. Bueno, eso es de lo que vamos a hablar durante estos días. Gracias por estar aquí. Gracias también a todas las personas que han mandado sus trabajos y sus investigaciones sobre este tema. Y de verdad, esperamos que paséis unas jornadas estupendas aquí entre nosotros. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, decano. Bueno, lo primero para mí es un honor estar aquí. en una facultad que considero, como buen complutense que soy, mi casa. Una facultad con una actividad pasmosa, con un número de estudiantes elevado, con una calidad y una vocación por la enseñanza y la investigación inigualables. Yo coincidí con el decano actual cuando él era vicedecano, en un grandísimo proyecto que tuvimos, yo era vicerrector entonces de posgrado, para la formación de todos los profesores de primaria y secundaria, no sé si se hablaría así, de Ecuador, en un proyecto que sobrepasó todos los cánones que teníamos en esta universidad y que salió brillantemente gracias al empuje de esta facultad, pilotada naturalmente por la decana de entonces y su vicedecano. Así que yo no puedo estar más agradecido a esta facultad y para mí es, bueno, como llegar, como digo, a casa. Y es un honor, decano, como no podía faltar, y la verdad que lo estoy disfrutando muchísimo y he aprendido mucho de vosotros. Lo primero, felicitar a los organizadores. Los que hayan organizado alguna vez un congreso de este calibre, pues ya saben lo difícil que es, ¿no? El conciliar las agendas, los programas, las dificultades organizativas, el esfuerzo de muchísimas personas que lo hacen con todo el corazón y de forma voluntaria y altruista, ¿no? Y es digno de elogio, sobre todo cuando salimos, como se ha mencionado antes, salimos. Esperamos que no volvamos, de una terrible pandemia que tan duro nos ha golpeado a todas las sociedades, que nos ha golpeado de forma global y que tanto ha hecho por cambiar nuestras sociedades y que tanto ha hecho por cambiar la perspectiva que teníamos de la educación. Y la verdad es que ya solo el ver aquí algunas caras, aunque haya otras muchas a través de las redes, ya nos da muchísima más confianza, más alegría, más ganas. Como decía el decano, teníamos muchísimas ganas de volver a vernos, de estrecharnos, aunque sea con cautela y tocándonos el codo o chocando puños, el estar juntos de nuevo y vernos sonreír hasta detrás de las mascarillas, que era algo que necesitábamos, sobre todo en una sociedad como la española, latina, afectuosa, cariñosa, y a todos los que son de fuera y que han hecho el esfuerzo por venir a nuestro país o de otras regiones de nuestro país, agradeceros el esfuerzo para venir, porque las cosas, lo sabemos, no son nada fáciles, ¿no? Tenemos que aprender de esta pandemia a hacer cosas de una forma diferente, hemos tenido que aprender que de estos grandes retos que tenemos en nuestra sociedad global se sale solo con educación y con investigación, con ciencia, ¿no? Y la educación, este binomio que se ha formado en lo que define un poco el título de este congreso, como decía el decano, es la segunda vez que se organiza en la Complutense y esperamos que se pueda organizar alguno más, siempre que tengáis ganas y salgáis vivos de esto. Esta conjunción entre educación y democracia y la tradición, pues es más que oportuno en la situación en la que nos encontramos, ¿no? Ahora que se ha rememorado tanto el 50 aniversario de la Ley General de Educación y Financiamiento de la Reforma Educativa de 1970, la verdad que ahora estamos en un momento en donde estamos debatiendo en las universidades en España la famosa Ley Orgánica del Sistema Universitario, la LOSU, la tan polémica borrador de la Ley Orgánica del Sistema Universitario, así que es un buen momento para tener un congreso como este, ¿no? He estado viendo ahora un poco el programa, la verdad es que no había tenido tiempo de mirarlo antes, pero solo con los títulos de las conferencias, las ponencias, ya me apetecería quedarme aquí muchas veces y tocan aspectos que yo no, bueno, sí soy educador porque soy profesor, ¿no? Pero yo soy veterinario, así que estoy un poco más alejado de las teorías educativas y de la investigación en educación, pero yo aprendo muchísimo de mis compañeros de esta facultad y hemos recibido muchísimo asesoramiento. Pero cuando veo los títulos de algunas de las conferencias, la propia conferencia inaugural, se nota que es un congreso vivo que intenta dar respuesta a las necesidades de la teoría y la práctica educativa. Es verdad que pasar de la teoría a la práctica a veces es un poquito complicado, por no decir casi a veces imposible, ¿no? Pero en una universidad como la Complutense, una universidad pública, la universidad más grande presencial de España, donde trabajamos en muchísimas áreas y somos punteros en muchísimas cosas y deficitarios en otras tantas, eso ya sería arena de otro costal. al final no solo formamos profesores, no solo formamos veterinarios, no solo formamos médicos o abogados o economistas, ¿no? Formamos ciudadanos y personas comprometidas con estos nuevos paradigmas que tenemos, que son la sostenibilidad bueno, en realidad contribuimos a formar ciudadanos comprometidos tanto socialmente como medioambientalmente, y eso es muy importante, ¿no? Y para eso está la investigación, para eso están los jóvenes investigadores. El futuro de nuestra sociedad no depende tanto de los otros 4 que estamos en la mesa, sino de los jóvenes investigadores, ¿no? Es verdad que somos una universidad con muchísima tradición y la pone también en el Congreso, ¿no? Con muchísima historia, pero también con muchísimo futuro. Pero el futuro para algunos pues es un poquito más corto de lo que tenemos y por lo tanto dependemos del esfuerzo de nuestros jovencísimos, exultantemente, asquerosamente jóvenes investigadores, y que van a ser nuestros futuros docentes y científicos. Así que de verdad que Paloma, enhorabuena. Gracias por estar aquí y esperemos que os podamos dar, los más veteranos, respuesta a vuestras necesidades, porque la Complutense no sería ni la Complutense, ni la UNIR, ni la Universidad de Córdoba, ni la de Jaén, ni la del País Vasco. No seríamos nada solo viviendo del presente, sino que tenemos que trabajar por el futuro. Y en esto estamos hablando del futuro de educación, del futuro de la sociedad española y de la sociedad internacional. Así que agradezco muchísimo el trabajo realizado de nuevo, la presencia de mis 2 decanos, de la directora, de la coordinadora y de todos ustedes por su presencia, a todos los asistentes, y les deseo lo mejor para estos días. Muchísimas gracias.
se el jabón, pero está un poco sucio. No sé si funcionará. Te puedes quedar pegada. Ay, a ver, positivo, negativo. Positivo por acá. Y negativo por acá. Vale, es que hay que ponerlo ahí, se supone.
Buenas tardes, good evening everyone. Como sabéis, esta primera conferencia va a ser en inglés. Voy a empezar con la presentación en inglés. Una vez que terminemos, si alguien quiere hacer preguntas, las puede hacer directamente en inglés para el profesor Patrick Hogan, o bien hacerlas en español y haremos lo posible por trasladárselas. So, it's for me an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Patrick Hogan to this first conference as our keynote speaker. Professor Patrick Hogan is an emeritus of the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. He has a research interest in the quality of educational experience and in what makes learning environments conducive to fruitful learning. Prior to retirement, he led the research and development program Teaching and Learning for the 21st Century, a schools university initiative that commenced in 2003 and continues to grow. He is now involved in a number of cooperative research endeavors internationally. To date, he has published over 120 research items, including books, journal articles, book chapters, and commissioned pieces. His books include The Custody of Courtship of Experience, Western Education in Philosophical Perspective, The New Significance of Learning, Imaginations at Hard Work, Towards a Better Future, a review of the Irish school system, and he has published in Spain some articles like El corazón del asunto, revisando cuestiones éticas en la educación superior, and Shaping a New Ethical Landscape in Teacher Education, an Irish Experience in an International Context, la revista Bordón, revista de pedagogía. So, thank you, Professor Patrick Hogan. Welcome to this faculty, welcome to Madrid, and please, continue.
Thank you.
Okay. Profesores y participantes del Congreso. Quisiera comenzar agradeciendo a los organizadores la invitación para hablar aquí. De verdad, es un honor para mí. Entiendo que las deliberaciones de este Congreso son esencialmente en español. Estoy aprendiendo español un proyecto de mi jubilado, pero mis intentos de traducir el discurso al español producirá una curiosa mezcla de comedia y tragedia. Ciertamente ofendería el idioma y tus propios oídos. Voy a hablar entonces en inglés, pero no leeré el discurso palabra por palabra. Voy a parafrasear de vez en cuando y ilustrar puntos importantes con las dispositivas. Espero que logremos éxito. Okay, custodian or muse. The significance of tradition for educational thought and action. Now, mi nombre, Padraig, es en idioma irlandés. En inglés es Patrick, el santo patrón de Irlanda. So, it's idioma inglés. Mi primer idioma es irlandés. Okay. Next. Okay. 4 parts: tradition, influence, and bias. Secondly, tradition and the nature of human understanding. Third part, tradition and education, 2 contrasting approaches, and the first of these would be a custodial conversational approach or a combative conversational approach, and secondly, a universal conversational approach that I would recommend to educators. And finally, I look for an educational understanding of tradition itself. All right, the first part. Tradition, influence, and bias. Now, I think it's well to begin with a provisional definition or a provisional description of tradition. Firstly, tradition, we would say, it's the granting of a special importance by society or a group within society to certain beliefs, practices, and influences. Secondly, this importance plays a key part in forming the identity of the group, binding its members together. Thirdly, central to tradition is the respect that it gets, or the respect that is paid to it by successive generations that inherit it. All right. So there's tradition. Traditions extend to all domains of human life, including religion, culture, sport, the arts, entertainment, leisure, law, science, politics, business, industry, family and upbringing, funerals, and not least, education. Tradition covers all. Some traditions can be international or shared in their own way by different countries. For instance, traditions of hospitality, of family occasions, of commemorative festivals. Now, here's one you will recognize, I think, from here in Spain, the Santa Semana. And for me, I learned there's a lot of hard work, por los hombres, in carrying these. But the traditions are taken very seriously, including by people who may not be religious believers. The tradition has an importance that transcends that. Okay, next one. Here again from Spain, an international, known all over the world, the tradition of the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, which I have managed to complete myself, actually. And another, from my own country, a tradition of climbing the holy mountain of St. Patrick on the last Sunday of July every year. So some people, as you can see, will do it in their bare feet, descalzos. Okay? Okay, so traditions. Okay. Now, before I go on to that, there are some traditions that are not as inviting as the ones just described. Any of us could enjoy the traditions I have described already. But some traditions can be very harsh and very exclusionary and very divisive. I'm thinking of traditions of racial persecution, for instance, the Ku Klux Klan in the United States, who has very, very deep traditions. Traditions of female genital mutilation, traditions of denying education to women, traditions like arranged marriages where the spouses do not choose each other but have their spouses chosen for them. Now, all of these traditions are still alive in various parts of the world today, even though they may be illegal. So, when we look back into European history, we can see that many traditions we have in Europe are not traditions to be proud of, including in my country and yours, traditions of punishment, torture. So, tradition can be good, tradition can be quite offensive. In Spain, the Spanish writers that I have been familiar with over the last, say, 20, 30 years, where I have been studying people like Federico Garcia Lorca, Miguel de Unamuno, Jose Ortega y Gasset, and not least Maria Zambrano. They have written very much about tradition in this country, and their insights have helped to get a deeper understanding of how tradition can sometimes take over for young people and for new generations the questions that they need to confront themselves, whether questions of marriage, of family, of political loyalty, religious belief, whatever. I think this country is peculiarly fortunate to have in its thinkers people who have interrogated tradition as deeply as they have. And I would look forward, when I know Spanish, my Spanish improves, to getting to closer terms with these. Okay. So from what I've been saying, I want to call our attention now to prejudice as it operates in tradition. Because of the preferential value that it gives to certain beliefs, attitudes, and practices, tradition can cultivate prejudices that are very powerful, but that remain inconspicuous or invisible as prejudices. Secondly, although the word prejudice carries primarily negative connotations, there can be prejudices that are positive. Unexamined beliefs that are favourable rather than unfavourable. I, for instance, might have a prejudice in favour of a certain kind of music. I might have a prejudice in favour of certain cultures, not ones that I have examined, but I just happen to love them. So I don't want to give the impression that prejudice is, from my last remarks, something which is primarily negative. It is a very complex thing, prejudice, and it is often influenced by factors that we are not fully aware of, and that's something I want to make clear in the remainder of my address here today. Okay, I want to take an example from the field of learning now. If we look historically at a very famous example of a conflict between learning and tradition, and that example is the example of Galileo from the 17th century. Galileo was a scholar, a university teacher and researcher in Italy, in Padua, and he knew that his theoretical speculations and his observations did not fit with what the traditions of the Catholic Church permitted to be taught and to be thought. Galileo landed in trouble. Next one. This is the trouble. Galileo before the Inquisition at Rome. So his entire research project had to be stopped. And he lived in house arrest, under house arrest for the remainder of his life. So what happened to the research project? Well, we know it was exported to England, where scholars in Britain took it up, and gradually, it took centuries, Galileo's view came to be accepted by the Vatican itself. The Vatican apologized to Galileo in 1992, issued a formal apology from Rome to Galileo. Now, there are some lessons we can learn from this, important lessons. If we go next one. 2. The first one, an entire institution, in this case the papacy, can become a prisoner of prejudice. And it can remain a prisoner of prejudice for centuries, with all its power and all its teaching authority. Now, I'm not just talking about the Vatican here. You could talk about the socialist or administrations, any kind of empires of old. We know a lot about it in Ireland from our historical relations with Britain. An entire administration, an entire empire can be prisoners of traditions that are harmful to others and can remain so for centuries. But at the end of the day, secondly, to uphold dogmatically the merits of one's own tradition and to assert its incompatibility with other traditions, which must therefore be wrong, tends to be self-defeating in the long run. And I think empires all over the world find that out eventually. But much harm can be done along the way. Okay. Now, reflection on the educational merit of these points prompts the question whether tradition is to be regarded as a custodian, preserver of everything, or as a muse, source of inspiration. This question, which I have chosen as my title, places the focus on two prominent but opposite ways in which tradition can be regarded. Those who align themselves with the custodial aspects of tradition can readily be seen as conservatives or even as fundamentalists. On the other hand, those who see tradition mainly as a muse or source of inspiration, they tend to be regarded as innovators or activists, sometimes even as iconoclasts, vanguardia, avant-gardes, etc. But this either-or way that the custodian muse question is posed reflects a widespread, a conventional way of putting the matter. But I think this stance also preserves a sense of divisiveness in how tradition is to be understood, especially in an educational context. One? No, one before that. Yeah, custodian and muse. Okay. It can lead teachers and students to have premature loyalties. Loyalties that may be neglectful or biased or otherwise exclusionary, whether on grounds of ethnicity, religion, social class, gender, sexual orientation, or whatever. In my early days as a teacher, I offended against many of these, there's no doubt. But I was not aware, because of the loyalties that I would have, unexamined loyalties to traditions of different kinds. Okay. I did not intend to do harm, and teachers generally don't. But somehow schools can often end up doing harms where no harm was intended. Okay. From an educational point of view, then, it is important, it would seem very important, that education would put its house in order, that it should always do so, and that it should seek to overcome inherited prejudices lodged in curriculum traditions or in long-standing practices of teaching and learning. And one of the first to come up with this view, one of the most famous, not one of the first, one of the most famous, was Thomas Jefferson, who became President of the United States. He was founder of the University of Virginia. And in 1820, he engaged in a correspondence with many of the funders and the people who would become the first governors of the University of Virginia, and says, this is the kind of university we want. We will wipe away prejudice. Okay, Juan. This institution, the University of Virginia, will be based on the unlimited freedom of the human mind. For here, we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor are we afraid to tolerate any error so long as reason is free to combat it. Now, as a young teacher, I thought that was a great aspiration. Let us eliminate prejudice. It's not as easy as that. The aspiration to eliminate prejudice, I think it seems to be in the grip of a prejudice itself. A disabling kind of prejudice, all the more effective because it is a prejudice that is held unconsciously by the likes of Thomas Jefferson and by the likes of myself as a younger teacher. This prejudice can be described as the mistaken belief in the supreme capabilities of human reason, the belief that a careful use of reason can eliminate bias from human thought and action, and can confidently approach tradition in an impartial way. So, there's the first part of my address. We'll move to the second. Part 2, tradition and the nature of human understanding. So, if you'll permit me a few more autobiographical remarks, I'll explain the connection between. In my own early experiences as a teacher in an urban comprehensive school in Ireland, I was continually struck by the biases that many pupils brought with them into the classroom daily. These included frequent attribution of bad motives to the teachers, even malevolent motives to the teachers, and to the school, to the rules of the school, the students' preconceived notions about the other classes in the schools, about other pupils in their own classroom, and about issues of gender, race, and social class. Also, strong hostility towards some of the subjects they were studying. And these are just a few items from a longer list that I noted. I was equally struck, however, by the biases or prejudices among the teachers, as these became evident in the unguarded comments over a cup of coffee or lunch in the staff room. It was disconcerting to hear the casual way in which very negative judgments about students were voiced and shared by colleagues who were, by and large, decent human beings. There were, of course, some teachers who regularly stood up for the troublesome students, but for the most part, the assertiveness of teachers' negative judgments was much more common than was the evidence that would support these. So I drew up for myself a kind of research program. The research program I gradually drew up sought to discover the best ways of identifying and removing distorted perceptions that were common among teachers and pupils and were continually harmful to educational practice. And that became the project for my PhD thesis. Tradition didn't feature explicitly in this research program at the start, but it soon found its way to the center of my concerns. Now, my boldness did not match that of Thomas Jefferson, but I was nevertheless confident of achieving promising results that would be strongly grounded in reason, and I hoped to make my own contribution to educational research. But I was taken aback, and badly taken aback, during my studies when I came across the following remark by the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer in his major work, Truth and Method. Here we are, one. Now, that was bad news for me. The prejudice of the individual, far more than his judgments, constitute the historical reality of his being. And next, even more explicit, it is not so much our judgments as it is our prejudices that constitute our being. I had learned in Aristotle that man is a rational animal, not prejudiced. So where's this going? This was very disconcerting. It caused me, well, quite a few sleepless nights. Gadamer seemed to be saying that something from our own previous experience is always active, and that the desire for a completely unbiased or unprejudiced reason is understandable but mistaken. Something from past experience, some influences from the past invariably intervene in all our efforts to understand. Now, Gadamer had been a student of Heidegger in Germany, and Heidegger had talked about human understanding having a four structure. He says, we never understand something just as a sound or as a sight or something cognitive, and then subsequently that we add interpretation to. No, he says, from the very first, interpretation is built into it. When we hear something, we hear it as a piece of music, as a piece of classical music, as a piece of flamenco music. We cannot help but do that. There is an as, or if we hear something, a speech, we hear it as boring, as fascinating, as threatening, as an insult, as a foreign language, but there is always an as in some interpretation. Even when we don't understand something, we understand it as puzzling or as perplexing, as frustrating. So interpretation, Heidegger took on a lot of psychologists at the time, and this was very controversial to say that human understanding was interpretative from the very start. But it was Gadamer who pushed Heidegger's discoveries to their logical conclusion. His key point is, and here we are, okay, Juan. Inescapably, we understand through our preconceptions, including our prejudices, and we cannot understand either well or badly without them. Now, for me, as a teacher, or for any of us who are involved in education, I think that is fundamentally important. Secondly, such preconceptions, prior assumptions, preconceived ideas, predispositions, prejudgments, and so on, continually act as filters in our understanding, whether we are aware of them or not. They represent the ceaseless movements of tradition in the background or the foreground of our experience. When I eventually came to terms with that insight, my whole practice as a teacher changed, and my whole understanding of educational research changed. Okay. Now, I want to move from this to talk about the kind of shift in historical understanding or in research understanding that it brought about. And this insight, which many would say was relativistic in its early years, because if interpretation governs everything, who's to say your interpretation is better than mine or somebody else's? And if you stay with that, well, isn't that relativism? So Gadamer was criticised by Habermas and by others for the relativistic manner of his thinking. He answered that. He says, we could probably, if we were gods, if we were not historical creatures, if we could be divine, if we could get an overview of the entire world that the immortals might get, yes, we could talk about maybe an unprejudiced view. But limited human beings that we are, the best we can do, the best we can achieve is a partial understanding. Even the best human understanding is still a partial understanding. and in both senses of the word, incomplete and burdened by bias. That applies to all of us, as teachers, students, politicians, scientists, businessmen, businesswomen, whatever. Okay. But the influence of this over the social sciences began to spread. And even in philosophy, analytic philosophers, pragmatist philosophers, they began to see, look, our very preoccupations with knowledge and certainty, maybe they were wrong. You will recall that epistemology was the discipline that said that anything less than certainty is a deficiency that must be remedied. Now, the shift in thinking I'm talking about here says that it takes a different view. It says certainty is probably something we will never fully achieve because we are not divine, but we can improve, and the best we can do is offer our best thoughts to date for the criticism of our colleagues. Therefore, our orientation is to converse with colleagues, to listen to colleagues, to invite criticism from colleagues. Okay, you can move. Now, so I've numbered the kind of shift in the consequences of the shift in thinking from the work of Gadamer, which was later shared by others. Firstly, it led to abandoning the idea that anything less than unshakable foundations for knowledge is a deficiency that needs to be remedied. Secondly, acknowledging that human truth claims are best regarded as assertions that are warranted, that need to be warranted with evidence. Thirdly, acknowledging that the fruits of even the best human inquiries, notwithstanding their merits, are partial and provisional. Fourthly, the emergence of a fresh and distinct ethical orientation for the conduct of study and research, namely a conversational orientation that is disposed to go out, speak to others, and more importantly, listen to others and invite criticism from others. Okay, next one. All right, so that move from there, I'm moving into tradition and education, looking at two contrasting conversational approaches. I should say that within a conversational orientation that I've just talked about there can be different variants. For instance, some variance leads towards a combative understanding of tradition, and others are more thoroughly conversational, seeing tradition itself as a source of inspirations of a more universal kind. So in this section now, we will review both of these. And we'll begin with a custodial approach to tradition advocated by Alistair MacIntyre, and then turn to Gadamer's exploration of tradition as something more universal. All right. Okay, part 3, yeah. Go ahead, Johan. Now, MacIntyre is one of the best-known Anglophone philosophers in the field of ethics and ethical practice. And he takes the view that all reasoning takes place within the context of some traditional mode of thought, transcending through criticism and invention the limitations of what had been previously reasoned in that tradition. This is as true of modern physics, he says, as of medieval logic. Now, some physicists they say, oh no, we're concerned with facts. MacIntyre would say to them, no, you live as inheritors of a tradition of inquiry. And it is in that tradition that your research is based. And all reasoning, he says, scientific, religious, historical, literary, always takes in that. Now, there's a very strong parallel here between what MacIntyre is saying and what Gadamer is saying. The influence of previous thoughts and previous accomplishments in inheritances of learning. Okay. Like Gadamer, MacIntyre stresses that it is not possible for humans to attain a superior standpoint outside of the social and historical influences of human life. If you could, it would provide an incontestable kind of understanding, and that's, of course, what epistemology sought. But on this matter, MacIntyre says, I am irremediably anti-Hegelian, he says, because I reject the notion of an absolute standpoint independent of the particularity of all traditions. We always understand, he says, within tradition. So there's a strong parallel between Gadamer himself. All right. Okay, we can go to the next one. McIntyre's, he moves on, and this is where the combative bit comes in. We are, in fact, he says, inheritors, if that's the right word, of a number of incompatible and rival traditions, and there is no way of either selecting a list of books to be read or advancing a determinate account of how they are to be read pedagogically, interpreted and elucidated, which does not involve taking a partisan stand in the conflict of traditions. So he says you have to stand for your tradition, and you can be conversational, go forward, engage in ordered conflict or ordered controversy with others, but at the end of the day you are a defender of your tradition. Now, at first sight, this looks like a regression to some kind of traditionalist approach, but McIntyre is careful to point out that it differs from such standpoints in being prepared to put its own claims to truth at risk. If he was a true traditionalist, he would not be prepared to put his own claim to truth at risk. Now, McIntyre is a defender of an Augustinian Catholic position. He says historically he had been a Marxist, he had been an analytic philosopher, but in his later life he converted to Catholicism and is now, he's still alive, he's now one of the foremost advocates of, if you like, a Catholic tradition which is open to conversation and inquiry with other traditions, but which maintains at the end of the day its own, I won't say supremacy, but its own claim to truth as a superior one. Okay, so I want to summarize on that by going to the core elements of McIntyre's point of view. Juan, the next one. And there are three that I've picked out here. Firstly, educational action should serve a particular tradition. It will converse with other traditions. It will try to see its own biases. It will try to overcome its own biases, but at the end of the day, it serves a particular tradition. It can best do so by engaging in ordered conflict with other traditions in the activities of teaching, learning, and research. And for these reasons, education, he says, is a subordinate practice because it serves a particular tradition, be it Catholic, Protestant, whatever the case may be. So it is not a practice in its own right. It is not a universal practice. One prominent consequence of that is McIntyre, he said, there are a plurality of traditions. So what you would do in concrete, you would have a plurality of different kinds of schools. The other view that I'm going to talk about would have say, include as much plurality within each school. Okay, so I'm going to move to that view now, and that is the conversational view associated mainly with Gadamer. First of all, Gadamer says, look, my intention when I set out was to try to understand how is human understanding possible. I wasn't trying to defend one tradition or another, but my abiding concern, and he had answered against his critics, how is understanding possible? What happens to us when we understand, even above our wanting and doing? Okay, Juan? So, now, he had been criticized particularly by Jürgen Habermas. Later, Habermas came to accept very much more of Gadamer's viewpoint. His aim is to answer that question, how is understanding possible? And my real concern was and is philosophic, not with what we do or what we ought to do in this tradition or that, but what happens to ourselves over and above our wanting and doing. What happens to us behind our backs, as it were. All right. So the influences for Gadamer that make up human understanding, he calls them an overlying background. The German word is Überlieferung, overlying. And tradition for him is the totality of influences that we know and that we don't know. Because many influences that we are not aware of, many I might not be aware of until my students point them out to me, until my colleagues point them out to me. And if I'm smart, or if I'm wise, or if I am disposed to listen to them and perhaps improve my understanding without perfecting it totally. All right. Now, we can move to the next one. Press again. Yeah. Okay. We get a lot. Both Gadamer and McIntyre acknowledge that human understanding is always embedded in tradition. But Gadamer takes tradition to mean the totality of influences, explicit and implicit, that continually lie over us, lie over human experience in all instances of understanding, including those in the classroom, in the library, wherever. He uses the phrase, the dialogue that we are. In German is das Gespräch, das wir sind, that we ourselves are, to emphasize the necessity to be aware of these influences and to be responsive to them, even to acknowledge that there might be something important and valuable in what initially looks alien, in the stranger. Okay. Now, to conclude in this part of it, there is much more that could be said in relation to custodial and conversation conceptions of tradition, beyond the confines of an oral address such as this. But the initial investigation I have attempted here makes available some important points for understanding the significance of tradition for educational thought and action. So the final part of the presentation will bring together and briefly review some of these. Okay, Juan? No. So I'm after an educational understanding of tradition, and the reason I've used that is that if we're speaking as an educator, I'm not speaking here as a politician or as a priest or a member of a religious order or a defender of this particular tradition. As educators, we need an understanding of tradition that is capable of rising above some of the, sorry, I exceed myself, that is at least aware of the necessity to be open to critique and to know that the best research will never be in a position to have an all-embracing understanding or a final understanding. Okay, so an educational understanding of tradition. Now, such an understanding, springing from the conversational orientation like we've been exploring, uncovers original opportunities for a teacher to take a leadership role in the interplay of influences. Because if influences are at play, the interplay of influences, and to do so in ways that are both defensible and promising. Similarly, it offers many possibilities for education to advance as a practice in its own right, not a subordinate practice like McIntyre spoke about, but a practice in its own right, as distinct from a subordinate one. Okay, I have in the remaining slides just summarized some of these features. I've treated them at more length in the paper, but if we can look at them briefly here, at the list, okay. An educational understanding of tradition. The first feature, tradition in any field is now seen as a totality of influences, of voices, namely inheritance of learning. Now, Michael Oakeshott, the English philosopher, is now dead, but he used a phrase, the teacher is someone in whom an inheritance of learning is alive. So the teacher, whether in music, in physics, in mathematics, in geography, in business studies, a tradition of learning lives in the teacher. The teacher is maybe battling, living it, having love affairs within this tradition, I mean that, but it is a relationship. And if the tradition, if an inheritance of learning is not alive in the teacher, then nothing is said. It's dead. Inert matter. Okay. Secondly, I forgot. The important point here is that the teacher, not only must it be alive in the teacher, it must be alive in such a way that it can evoke a response. Say something and evoke a response. So it is not so much a matter of transmission, but a matter of evoking a response, getting different points of view, and moving together to a better understanding, whether that be of the Reformation, or of the theory of relativity, or of some peculiar part of Bach's music, or whatever. It is joining an inquiry, and that is the educational responsibility. Okay. So, a joint engagement, an active interplay rather than a transmission. Fourthly, this interplay seeks to reveal both the riches and the conflicts within that reside within the different voices or different traditions, different subjects, you could call them here, to be plain about it. So subjects like maths, history, geography, they're now considered as voices which seek to say something to students and evoke a response. All right. Next one. This entire conversational pedagogical effort seeks to enhance educational experience by opening up new imaginative neighbourhoods, new landscapes for thought and heart to dwell in them. Now, you've often heard the phrase lost in a book, when a child gets fascinated, lost in a book. Teaching is successful, education is successful when a new imaginative landscape opens up and absorbs the learner, not just in that landscape, but also in its conflicts. And if the word fluency has any meaning, it is not just the repetition of becoming more practiced, it is also getting the heart more involved in the subject in question, as I'm finding now myself in my learning of Spanish, including the many frustrations that I have. So it is a new landscape that opens up. This is what teaching and learning are about, not about transmission. So by learning to become gradually more at home in these landscapes or neighbourhoods, students discover key aspects of their own sense of identity, including their possibilities and limitations. I might discover something, for instance, that, music, I respond to music marvellously, but really that maths might not be for me in the future. The gradual discovery of one's own promise and one's limitations. Okay. And therefore come to respect human plurality in some really meaningful sense. And then sixthly, the actions that are informed by this kind of thinking make education an important practice in its own right, as distinct from any subordinate kind of undertaking, because the responsibilities it has are different from those of the politicians, of the priest, of the business person, or whatever. So to conclude then, or sum up, the core of my case is that educational thought and action are conversational from the very start. In consequence, there is not a rift here. There is no rift between thought on the one hand and action on the other, as if the former were a domain of theory and the latter a domain of practice. Practice is thought informed from the very start. Keeping the focus on experience of human understanding and its inescapable features, as I've been attempting to do here, enables pedagogy to achieve a fertile belonging together of thought and action. This belonging together also underlies the distinctiveness of pedagogy itself and of education as an independent practice that can sustain tradition and hopefully renew it in all its complexity, its diversity, and its conflicts. I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick, for your very challenging talk, which fits very well on the topics that we are discussing here in this conference these days. And I would like to thank you also for your clarity in your discourse, because I'm sure that the people will follow it very well. So we have now time for questions. So if you wish, just raise your hand, and the students that are at the end of this, pedírselo a las compañeras que están por allí. Questions? So I will be the first one to break in the ice. So I was thinking about the comparison of the similarities between the tradition and the country. I mean, how can we feel this respect for the tradition, and how can we promote that in the schools, taking into account the similarities between tradition and patriotism? I have been reading some papers from Michael Hand from the University of Birmingham, who is talking about the problematic teaching of patriotism in schools. And I see some similarities between what you said here about this criticism and the problems that we can have with the love for our country. And it seems to me that is similar to the love for our tradition. We can feel like there is a betrayal between what we think or what we love, because we should respect what we have from our parents, from the people that come before us. Taking into account that we have some students here, what we should do in the schools with our pupils in primary education, for example?
Patriotism and the love of one's country, I think that will always be something that politicians will rightly, I think, encourage, patriotism and love of country. As educators, yes, when countries gain their freedom, it is usually very difficult for politicians to say, we will now allow schools to have the freedom to engage as professionals the same way as we allow doctors and nurses. No, almost always you will find, now that we are in an independent country, we will use the schools to build the national fibre and self-respect. It has happened in this country after the Civil War. It had happened in Ireland after independence from Britain. And it is very difficult to say why it wouldn't. I think there are dangers in schools doing that. The dangers in schools doing that are because schools have a different responsibility. The responsibility that education as a practice has is to the plurality of traditions. And all the more so in societies where that plurality has been divided. It has been here, it has been in most European countries. So from education's point of view, we need to understand that the responsibility is to see that the different voices of different traditions get heard and get understood. So that if I am growing up in my country, say if it was Ireland, I need to understand that there may have been something worthwhile in the British administrations. You understand? I'll avoid talking about Spain. But the example I give, I think it helps to illustrate that the responsibilities of education are different from the responsibilities of politics. And that is one of the things that is not sufficiently understood. Because politics, almost by the winning party in politics, it cannot help it very often. It imposes its own way, at least until the next election. And if the next election is postponed for another while, it gets more dangerous. So the office of schooling, if I can use that term, is a different office from the office of politics.
Okay. Thank you. More questions? Gonzalo?
this talk. I have many questions, but I just want to make one. From an educational point of view, have all the traditions the same value?
Sorry, Gonzalo, I wonder.
Sorry, yeah.
Okay, I think that will improve a lot now.
Okay, what I want to question is, if you think that from an educational point of view, all the traditions have the same value, or put it in another way, have all the traditions, the different traditions, the same capacity to provoke a conversation?
Yes, have all traditions a capacity to provoke a conversation. I would say yes, but with the qualification. There are some traditions which will see themselves as not about conversation. Some of the ones I mentioned earlier on, we could take the example of the Taliban at the moment, to say they are not interested in a conversation. They want to use schools, places without women, places where one particular view would go. Now, I think it is important for us, for anybody in schools, to understand in what kind of context would that kind of tradition make sense. So, look, understand the historical context. Why and how did it come to be the tradition that it is? How and why did it become to be so oppressive of one half of humanity? How and why did it regard the conversation, I would regard, as a vice rather than a professional responsibility? So, in response to you, potentially, I think all traditions can have the potential to be educationally fruitful so long as they are admitted to the conversation on educational grounds. And they need to be critiqued, because some traditions do not see themselves as listening to another point of view or allowing that there might be some points of merit in the contrary viewpoint. Okay.
Thank you.
We have time for more questions.
I think there's one there. There's one man.
Miguel.
Thank you so much for your talk. At the beginning of your conference, you explained that we have...
Sorry, may I ask you to remove the mask just for the speech? Because
I was saying that at the beginning of your talk, you divide between good prejudice and bad prejudice. Mm-hmm. And I would like that you explain this idea better, because for me it's different to make a clear differentiation when you have a good prejudice and bad prejudice.
Let me see if I understand correctly. The difference between good prejudice and bad prejudice, from my point of view, would be a good prejudice would be a prejudice that happens to have beneficial effects. Beneficial as distinct from harmful effects. Normally we associate prejudice with narrow-mindedness, bigotry, hatred of other people, but it is possible to have a prejudice that would have a beneficial effect, a happy consequence. The example I gave, I think, in the beginning, say if somebody likes Spaniards, if say, oh, I love the Spaniards, that's, there's a better one that I think of. Joe Biden, the American president, he was asked about Ireland, this made big news in Ireland, and some English journalist asked him, can you tell us, do you want to talk about the protocol in Northern Ireland? He says, you can ask me any time about Ireland. He says, I love Ireland. Now, that is a prejudice, but it happens to be a prejudice that is favourable to an Irish point of view against Brexit, and it is not liked by the English Brexiteers. Do you understand what I mean? So the prejudice, it has beneficial effects for Irish people and for the EU people, but not for England. So,
Thank you.
but it is a prejudice. I mean, you could look at it and say, well, Joe, you need to examine maybe the influences that are working behind his back, the influences from the past. And he did acknowledge them, actually. He says that my grandmother came over here because, well, they were kicked out by the British, so they had to immigrate. They were immigrants. So there are these influences, and they come down, I think in Joe Biden's case, 4 or 5 generations. And that can happen. Tradition can work silently or maybe behind our back. I use the phrase by the back door. You understand that phrase? To come by the back door rather than by the front door. Because what comes by the back door, we might not be as aware of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? José Luis, Lucía, por aquí.
Thank you very much. From my point of view, prejudices are not good or bad, but useful. Because
but useful.
Useful. They are useful because we can translate reality into our imperfect language, because we are imperfect beings. So, therefore, I find here that there is something missing maybe, and where's the place for aspirations and for dreams? Because tradition is in relation with the known, but what about the unknown? What about part of the human being that I didn't find here? Maybe it's a completely different presentation that could complement this or not, but I find something missing here, but I don't know specifically what it is, but I had to ask. So where is the place, from your point of view, for the dreams and
for
dreams.
Working, yeah, dreams and aspirations.
Oh, dreams and aspirations,
that's right,
yes.
of the human being.
Yes. Yeah. The phrase I use, human understanding, has to take into account everything that occurs in human experience. It is inclusive. It has to include our dreams, our aspirations, our hopes for the future. Now, if we understand this educationally, in an educational context, teachers are faced with pupils who have aspirations in any class, unfulfilled dreams. The office of education, or the task, the responsibility of education, is to engage with the emerging identities of young people, the emerging aspirations, and hopefully identify pathways that are fruitful for the different kinds of sensibility that they deal, to help a young person to discover something of the historian in themselves, to discover something of their own artistic promise. And there we're into aspiration. Because very often it can happen that throughout an entire schooling, the real potentialities of the pupils were never addressed, were never even discovered. So the responsibility of schooling, more than it's not about transmission thing, it's about evoking just the very thing you're talking about. The dreams, the aspirations, the actual promise of one child as distinct from another. It's difficult to do it in very large classes, but the responsibility is there nevertheless. And I think I know many teachers, most of us here must know many teachers who are stunned by the promise that students can have. Unforeseen promise. Even students who might be unpromising, then one day they show, God, there's a revelation, an epiphany almost, and a new pathway opens up. Now, that is one of the great joys of teaching, to help in uncovering these dreams, genuine dreams and aspirations. Thank you, because you have put your finger on something very important. Now, I should add that in finding that aspiration, it might be resistant. my best efforts as a teacher to help a student could be resisted again and again, and it may take us some time and some disagreement before we find a way of approaching that we can find a fruitful future. Okay, thanks. Sorry for not hearing you correctly in the beginning, but your question was a very important one. Yeah.
Professor, thank you for your talk. How do you think we can inspire the importance of tradition in these postmodern societies? Mostly students are keen on taking morality or ethics as primary, I think, merely based on opinion or preference. And we have the challenge maybe to find a more universal ground where this dialogue you were talking about is possible. Maybe these dreams or inspirations, I don't know his name, what you mentioned about. And I'm not sure if you think talking about something universal we share in common is possible, more than tradition.
Yeah.
Not sure.
I'm not sure if I got it all, but if I make a mistake, if I start on the wrong path, stop me, please.
Yes.
Okay. When I mentioned the phrase, this universal dialogue, the dialogue that we are, most people do not see life in that way. They do not see it in terms of a dialogue or even a potential dialogue. Some politicians do. They will call them stateswomen and statesmen, but not always. I say for educators, it is very important to conceive of life in terms of a dialogue with thoughts that have been taught in the past and with thoughts that we have never come to yet. So education is a distinct, its research responsibilities, if you like, must keep the door open to the dialogue, must practice this dialogue, and must practice the invitation of criticism from colleagues, as distinct from defending my own point of view at all costs and making sure that at the end of the day my point of view will be the winner. Now, we can point to many instances in the history, not just of Western education, but the history of education, where the victorious party would be, look, we want to convert everybody to the point of view of the victorious party. And that did a great disservice to human plurality. Now, for a democracy, particularly for a democracy, it is crucial for the political literacy of the country that at least there will be some understanding of plurality and a very different point of view, because we have to make coalitions, we have to make accommodations with each other. The alternative, as we know, is very bad. So the office, that I say, the responsibilities of education have to be to keep this dialogue in all disciplines alive and healthy. That goes for physics as it goes for history. It goes for chemistry, music. In all of these disciplines, there are possibilities for conflict and there are possibilities for greater enrichment and greater understanding. So the educational responsibility to the traditions is to keep the diversity alive and to enhance it.
Okay, thank you.
We have another question. Middle, Samantha.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your talk. Yes. As you said, sometimes our traditions harm people, for example, social class, religion, gender, sexual orientation. And I was thinking about, is really prejudice as powerful to make so much harm, where is this soft, skinny line when traditions start being a prejudice in our society?
Yeah. A tradition begins to be prejudicial in the bad sense when it begins to see anybody who doesn't belong to that tradition as an enemy, not just as a political opponent, but as an enemy, to be maybe wiped out, killed, eliminated, and we have many examples in history. So I think that would be the distinction there.
Okay, but for example, you already also said that when you start your research program, you find that our past experiences make us like being a prejudiced persons. How our past experience can make us like that?
Yes. It is inevitable that your past experience will be, to some extent, experience of limitation, experience of excluding others, whether it's on grounds of colour of face, religion, sexual orientation. Now, for teachers, I think it is very important for anybody involved. Teachers, when I say teachers, I mean educational researchers as well. Anybody who is seriously concerned in education must have some responsibility for opening up and addressing these prejudices and bringing them to light. And in fact, what's called the Socratic dialogue, the old example of Socrates, the whole idea was to engage in a conversation because it brings to light, it discovers the prejudices. They come out during the conversation, and I might say, oh, I never knew I was as prejudiced as that on issues of gender. I never knew. But the conversation that brings it out. So that's why I would say that my entire orientation would have been in philosophy of education would be Socratic, even though I didn't refer too much to it. But this is a discipline, I think, that pedagogy, at the heart of pedagogy resides or lives the discipline of self-criticism practiced with colleagues, self-critique. In the action research program that Juan spoke about, we did in the university, we did it through action research in the schools. And it was amazing when teachers began to work together and look at each other. Oh, this is the way you do it. Oh, I never knew that my questions were addressed to only 7 or 8 students in the class. The same 7 or 8 until my colleagues pointed out. I never realized that I'd use examples from football only and that the girls by and large were not interested. So these are the kinds of things that come to light. Harmless prejudices, but they are exclusionary.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Okay, I think that we have finished here. I would like to thank you for all your questions, especially thank you, Professor Patrick Hogan, for your clear responses. It has been a pleasure listening to you. And let me tell you something before we go. We have tenemos 40 minutos antes de que se salgan los autobuses de la puerta de la facultad para ir al centro riojano, a la recepción del CITE. Tenemos un ratito, pero por favor a menos 10 estar preparados para poder salir, menos 10, menos cuarto estar preparados para salir para allá. Thank you, Padre.
Okay, thank you, folks. Thank you.